It's Thursday, 11 o'clock, and it's time for this week's Watch Drop. The theme for this week is watch quandaries. What do I mean by that? Sounds a bit airy-fairy. Well, when you're collecting watches and you're thinking, okay, I need a sports watch and I've got this budget, often it's very easy to navigate your way down to a specific model, but there's often still some degree of variation amongst that model. I'll give you an example. I want a mid-size luxury sports watch. I really love the Nautilus 3800, but that watch comes in steel, it comes in precious metal, yellow gold, it comes in blue dials, it comes in white dials. There are earlier fonts, there are later fonts. There's condition versus overall value. Where do you put your money? How do you make that decision, and how do you navigate through those different criteria? Well, today I'm going to try and explain how my mind works, and hopefully that will help you navigate the same decision-making process. Let's jump into it and you'll figure out what I mean. Well, it's funny that I mentioned the 3800 because I've got two here, and I've got two really rare and beautiful examples. And frankly, if it was my money that I was spending, I wouldn't really know how I would navigate between these two. The 3800 for me is the Goldilocks size for the Nautilus. It's 37.5 millimeters from ear to ear, so actually it wears a little bit smaller than that. The 3700 is a watch that I think is a little bit too big for my tastes. The 3800 now has exactly the same aesthetic, but in a slightly more manageable, slightly more discreet aesthetic. Now, the obvious decision to go for when it comes to a 3800 is steel and blue. Yeah, that's where it all started. But if you, like me, like something that's a little bit adjacent to the obvious, something that's a little bit different, then these two models are really worth your consideration. The first one is the white dial 3800 1A. Now, this is a watch where you look at it and it looks factory fresh, yet it's from the 80s. There are no signs of polishing on this watch. And actually, when it comes to spending that kind of money on a watch that's coming up to 50 years old, that's a great place to put your money, I'd argue. I know that the material value of steel is relatively low, and so when you're spending £50,000 on something that's made of steel, it can hurt a little bit. But from future value's perspective, I'd argue that condition is the most important factor. Some of these watches were fairly cheap back in the day. These were actually worn in earnest, and so to get one that's survived 40 plus years so far is really, really special. The white dial on the 3800 is very rare. I've never seen one before, and it's a pleasure to hold this. What I really love about this white dial is you can really see the contrast of the tritium lume, which has gone a sort of yellowish colour. You can see that contrast against the bright white that really hasn't faded very much at all. I also just like the fact that for a small watch with a light coloured dial, it does wear a little bit bigger. It has more presence on the wrist, and because you've got every original facet on the case, and particularly the bezel, it just captures the light in a way that really it shouldn't do for a watch that's this size. It stands out much more proudly than you would imagine. I've seen lots of these 3800s over the years, and this example is absolutely exquisite and worth the additional value, I think, the additional cost. But let's jump on to another example, which is very similarly priced, but in yellow gold. The 3800/1J is a watch that when you pick it up, you realise there is an awful lot of gold in this thing, and there's something very charming about that. You've got the beautiful contrast to the blue dial, which is a very fumé finish, and it's really beautifully paired with actually a very dark date disc as well. And I think it is naturally blue on the background with a white text, but it almost could be black. I think it does blend in really nicely, actually. And some of these used to have white date discs, and that's something that I think is a little bit too high contrast against the blue, and so this works really, really well in that respect. Again, you've got the indices with tritium in them, and actually the yellowishness that is turned over the years almost makes it feel like a golden, fully golden indice, and so matches the case really well. The interesting part about this watch is that it has been worn. The metal is softer over steel, but it's aged to the point where it looks very vintage in its aesthetic. Very, very charming. There's no denying that from a material perspective, there's much more value in this. But when I look at the two of them together, I'm just completely torn as to which I would go for. The values are very close, but they do two different things, really. So what would I put in my collection? It's really interesting. We see so many of the steel 3800s with blue dials, but when I'm presented with these two, they just elevate slightly above that. They're that much more intriguing. These two watches, they're exactly the same model, but they've got two completely different personalities. One is sporty and super sharp, and the other is luxury and kind of blingy. So tell me in the comments, which would you choose? Yellow gold or steel? So let's move on now to one of my favourite models from Lange Söhne, the 1815 up-down. Now we've got two examples here. One is the earlier 1815 reference, which is a 35.9, let's call it 36mm case. That's a very, very classic looking watch. And if you want something that's slightly more modern, well, Lange has provided an updated version. This size is 39mm. It's about a millimeter thicker, but it feels so much more substantial. Let's start with the earlier one. When this watch was launched, it came as an evolution of the original 1815, which was with a single subdial for small seconds. And because these are manual wind watches, it's actually a really useful feature to know where you are on the power reserve. So you can put some more energy into it, and you can actually see this thing, because it's got 45 hours of power reserve and it's fairly highly geared. When you wind it, you see the power reserve move up almost proportionally, I guess, actually proportionally to the amount of turn that you put into the crown, which is a lovely thing actually. You have very traditional sizing. I think 36mm is a great size for a small gold dress watch. For me and my 18cm wrist, it fits really, really well. The lugs are nicely short, and you've got that beautiful Germanic design with the brushed mid-case and the polished bezel front and back. You turn it over and you've got a beautifully finished movement, as you'd expect from Lange, but it's quite diminutive in terms of the case proportions, but there's still enough of it to see and enjoy. It's a great watch, there's no two ways about it, but it feels like a mature gentleman's watch. The updated version is now much bigger in size, so we've gone up 3mm plus, but you've actually got a lot of the same design. You've still got that opaline dial, you've still got the blued Dauphine hands that contrast oh so well against that background. You've still got the two subdials in the same positions, but this has got a few more tricks up its sleeve. The power reserve now has gone up to 70 hours, and when you wind it, it does take so much longer for you to reach full power reserve. Now, if this watch does run out of power reserve, one of the cool things about this updated movement is the small seconds snaps back to 60 to the top, so that you can set it oh so precisely. And that's really the good thing about Lange, is that they create these technologies in their very expensive watches and they filter down to the entry level price points. This is not the most expensive Lange by a long way, but you've still got some of that really horlogerie technology and craftsmanship. This watch doesn't have a brushed mid-case, so it feels more, I guess, showy. And that's not a bad thing. Everyone is different. Some people like blingy, as we were talking about before. Some people like more discreet. And I think that's the difference between these two watches. Both of them give you that dress watch, which is top tier. It's an alternative to Patek, so you're not going to see everyone else at the dinner table wearing a Lange Söhne. It stands out as an individual decision. But do you want something that's slightly more traditional, slightly more discreet? Or do you want something that shouts a little bit louder, and it's highly polished, it's larger case size? Again, get in the comments, tell me what you think, because I'm truly drawn between these two. I don't know which one I would go for. Both very cool watches though. Now we're going to move on to the last quandary, and one that I think about oh so often. It's quite embarrassing. We're going to choose between two Cartier Santos models, both in yellow gold. One, a CPCP Santos Dumont, reference 1576, and another, a Santos Caree, which is on a yellow gold bracelet. It's called the Massif d'Or, and wow, both of them are exquisite. But let me tell you the quandary that I'm facing. The original Santos was worn by Santos Dumont. He's an explorer and adventurer, and someone that, while he was doing some flying or some absurd experience of some sort, he needed a wristwatch to keep time, to understand how far and how fast he was going for how long. So Cartier created what's often referred to as the first wristwatch. Now, the design, I think, is timeless. It hasn't changed much at all in that period, in over 100 years. And so I love the purity of this harking back to the original design. It's so thin. It's 4mm in overall height, 4.5. The movement inside was a record breaker from FPGA, and that is less than 2mm in overall height. And I just don't know how they've stacked it in something this size. It's unreal. This, being a 1576, actually has a small amount of guilloche to the dial, which I think is really interesting. I have it on my own Tank Louis as well, which is also CPCP, and it just adds a little bit more character to the often flat white dials. But it's a small watch, and because it doesn't have the bracelet, it can often feel insignificant. Feels almost like you're not wearing a watch. And I get comments sometimes when I've worn a Santos that it is a very, very small, miniature looking thing, almost like a toy, you know. And I don't know whether I agree with that. I battle with that thought time and time again. In my mind, it doesn't need to be any bigger. It's the example of elegance that I think back to all the time. It punches a real heavyweight punch above everything else because of the history, because of the iconic design. It doesn't need to be big and brash. But for those people that want a little bit more presence on the wrist, just a little bit more, there is the Caree in full yellow gold. Now this takes the original design and beefs it up, not just with a bracelet, but also with crown guards and an overall thicker, more substantial case. This feels like something that you could knock about. I wouldn't advise it because you'll get dents because it's soft yellow gold, but it can take a beating, this thing. It really is a tool-esque watch, certainly in comparison to the Santos Dumont, which is thin and fragile feeling. This feels the opposite. Now, the Santos Caree is an automatic movement. It makes for a better daily watch in that sense. When you're wearing it and you're moving your arms, it's winding itself and it's keeping good time. It has a date function, which, going back to our earlier comment, these days I don't use so much, but when it's buried in the background in the same color as the dial, it doesn't really stand out as something that's an eyesore. I think it works quite well in this example, but it is a blingy thing. There's no two ways about it. You can't hide from the affiliation with Wall Street. That's somewhere where you want to be flaunting your success. And if you were to do that, I can't think of anything more iconic than this. So why do I especially like the Caree over perhaps the latest version of the Santos or the previous Santos Galvier? Well, it's all to do with the flatness of the links. What you really get here with this bracelet is something that catches the light in so many different ways, in the same way that you get with the Royal Oak from Audemars Piguet. This is a piece of jewelry, and when the lugs and the links and the case itself is more rounded off, then you don't get that effect with the playfulness with light. It also has nowhere to hide when you look at the condition. When you see a Caree that has been overly polished or overly bashed about and abused, it really has a very, very different look. You lose all of the charm. So that's what you need to look out for when you're viewing these watches. Condition plays such an important part. It really turns something that's quite diminutive into something that has much more presence, almost much more masculinity to it. So which would you choose? The elegant, svelte, original, the Santos Dumont, or bold, brash, in-your-face Santos Caree Or Massif? I really don't know. I'd love to know your opinion. Let me know in the comments. So that's this week's drop. Over 100 watches hitting the site, and I've just covered off 3 Quandaries when there are many, many more if you go hit the website and check them out. I hope I've done something to help your decision making, and I look forward to hearing in the comments which one of these you like the most. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.